Every night at exactly 3:35 a.m. in the torrential rains of 1944, a guard at the Mauthausen Goose and Quarry complex walked a final patrol that should have spelled death for any prisoner in his path. His boots splashed through the neon-slicked mud in a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that the captives had decoded after months of terrified observation. But what the camp's high command never guessed, and what the patrolling sentries never saw, was that this man was orchestrating a betrayal so silent and so lethal that discovery meant the gallows. For 6 months, Unterscharführer Karl-Heinz Vogel deliberately left a heavy drainage hatch unbolted every single night, carving out a window of exactly 12 minutes where the ghosts of the quarry could slip into the Danube River and vanish. This is the story the Reich tried to erase, an impossible act of salvation conducted in the shadow of the granite crushers. The question that still haunts the survivors today is simple. Why would a decorated theology student turned SS soldier risk the executioner's blade to save the very people he was ordered to destroy? The Mauthausen complex sat in the jagged heart of the Austrian hills, a fortress of forced labor designed to grind human life into dust. By late 1944, thousands were trapped in its Work Group 7, dying slowly in the shadow of the quarry walls. This was a world of death by labor, where the guards were a mix of hardened veterans and fanatical investigators like Oscar Cross, known as the Bloodhound. Vogel, a man hollowed out by the blood harvest of the Eastern Front, was trapped in a uniform he loathed, until the night he found a message carved into the stone that changed everything. The granite crushers never stopped. Day and night, they ground the Austrian stone into gravel with a mechanical scream that drowned out everything. Screams, prayers, the crack of rifle fire. Karl-Heinz Vogel had learned to time his life by their rhythm. 3 minutes between each crushing cycle, 90 seconds of relative quiet when the machinery reset. In that silence, you could hear the rain hitting the quarry floor like bullets striking steel. Vogel stood at his post near the drainage tunnel, rain streaming off the brim of his cap, his SS uniform soaked through to the skin. At 34, he looked 50. His eyes were hollow, ringed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. The skin stretched tight across his cheekbones gave him the appearance of a skull wrapped in pale flesh. The other guards called him the Ghost because he barely spoke, barely ate, barely seemed alive at all. They assumed it was shell shock from the Eastern Front. They were half right. The truth was that Karl-Heinz Vogel was a man living in a body that had already died. 3 years earlier, in a Ukrainian village whose name he could no longer remember, he had been ordered to stand watch while an execution unit cleared a suspected partisan stronghold. He had watched them line up children against a barn wall. He had heard the commanding officer joke about ammunition waste. He had seen a girl, maybe 7 years old, clutching a rag doll as she stood in that line. And he had done nothing. Absolutely nothing. He had stood at attention, eyes forward, and let it happen. That night had carved something out of him that could never be replaced. He had returned to his unit a perfect soldier, silent, obedient, emotionless. He had been rewarded with a transfer to Mauthausen, away from the front lines, a cushy assignment, they told him, guard duty at a labor camp, easy work, a chance to recover. But Mauthausen wasn't easy. It was something worse than the front lines. It was industrial death, mechanized suffering on a scale that made battlefield carnage look merciful. The quarry wasn't designed to extract stone efficiently. It was designed to kill slowly. The prisoners, Skeletal figures in striped uniforms hauled granite blocks up 186 steps they called the stairs of death. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who couldn't rise were shot. The bodies were dragged back down and thrown into the crusher with the stone, ground into dust and gravel that would be used to build roads for the Reich. It happened on a Tuesday night in March. Vogel was inspecting a section of granite slabs that had been marked for transport when his flashlight caught something unusual. At first, he thought it was a natural fissure in the stone, a crack formed by the quarrying process. Then he looked closer, and his breath caught in his throat. Someone had carved words into the granite, tiny, precise letters cut with what must have been a nail or a shard of metal. The work would have taken weeks, maybe months, done in stolen moments when the guards weren't watching. Each letter was deliberate, carved deep enough to last, but small enough to escape casual notice. The message was simple. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Psalm 23, the same verse his father had read to him every night before bed when he was a child in Hamburg. The same verse he had recited during his theology exams at the university, back when he believed God was listening, back when he believed in anything at all. Vogel's hand trembled as he traced the letters with his fingertips. The stone was cold and wet from the rain, but the carved words felt like they were burning. Somewhere in this hell, someone still had enough hope to carve scripture into stone. Someone still believed that words mattered, that faith meant something, that God was watching, that there was something beyond the crushers and the gallows and the endless rain. He looked up at the quarry walls, at the watchtowers silhouetted against the storm clouds, at the prisoners huddled in their barracks like cattle waiting for slaughter. These weren't numbers in a ledger. These weren't enemies of the Reich. These were men who carved prayers into stone, men who still believed that someone, somewhere, might hear them, men who held on to their humanity even when the entire machinery of the Third Reich was designed to strip it away. Something shifted inside Vogel that night. Not a dramatic awakening. He was too hollowed out for that, too broken by what he had witnessed and what he had failed to prevent, but a quiet realization that he had a choice. He could continue being a ghost, a passive observer to atrocity, or he could become something else, something useful. He couldn't undo what he had done in Ukraine. He couldn't bring back the children against the barn wall. But maybe, just maybe, he could stop more people from dying. Maybe he could create his own carved message in the stone of history. The drainage tunnel was right there, 20 meters from his post. He had walked past it 1,000 times without really seeing it. It was an old system, built when the quarry was privately owned, designed to prevent flooding during the spring rains. The hatch was heavy iron, secured with a simple bolt. Beyond it was a channel that led directly to the Danube River, nearly 2 kilometers away through underground passages that had been forgotten by everyone except the maintenance crews. Vogel pulled the bolt. The hatch opened with a groan of rusted metal that made Vogel's heart stop. He froze, listening for footsteps, for shouts, for the click of a rifle being raised. But the only sound was the rain and the distant thunder of the crushers. The noise of the machinery was a blessing. It swallowed everything, creating a pocket of acoustic invisibility where actions could unfold unseen and unheard. Vogel peered into the darkness below. The drainage channel was about 1 meter wide, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. Water rushed along the bottom, cold and fast, fed by the rain and the runoff from the quarry operations. The smell that rose from the opening was industrial, oil, stone dust, and stagnant water. But it was also the smell of possibility. He tested the channel himself that first night, lowering himself through the hatch and crawling 20 meters into the darkness. The walls were rough stone, slick with algae and mineral deposits. The water soaked through his uniform within seconds, so cold it made his bones ache. But the channel was navigable. A desperate man could make it. A desperate man with nothing left to lose could crawl through this pipe and emerge somewhere beyond the fences and the guards and the machine guns. When Vogel climbed back out, he was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they might break. But he was also calculating. The channel worked. The question was how to use it without getting caught, without creating a pattern so obvious that even the most incompetent guard would notice. He studied the guard rotations with new eyes. The camp operated on rigid schedules, but those schedules had gaps, small windows where human laziness and routine created opportunities. Every night at 3:35 a.m., during the final patrol rotation before the dawn shift, there was a 12-minute gap in coverage. The guards in Watchtower 6 would huddle together to share cigarettes and complain about the cold, turning their backs to the quarry. The guards in Watchtower 7 couldn't see the drainage area because of the crusher building, and Vogel, as the perimeter guard, was expected to walk the eastern fence line, a route that took him directly past the drainage hatch. If you can't stand people who exploit the powerless for their own ambition, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type, "Nobody deserves that." Because what happened next with the man they called the Bloodhound only got worse. The first night, he simply left the bolt pulled back. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't leave a signal. He didn't know if anyone was even watching or if the prisoners had the organizational capacity to notice a single unbolted hatch in the darkness. He just opened the hatch and continued his patrol, his boots splashing through the mud in their usual rhythm, his face expressionless behind the rain. When he returned 12 minutes later, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs, the hatch was still open, and 3 prisoners were gone from the work detail that had been clearing debris near the crusher. Just gone, vanished into the rain and the darkness like they had never existed at all. Vogel closed the hatch with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He had just committed high treason, the kind that ended with a noose and a public execution, the kind that would disgrace his family and destroy everyone associated with him. But no alarm sounded, no guards came running. The camp continued its mechanical routine of suffering and death, completely oblivious to the fact that 3 men had just slipped through its fingers. The next night, he did it again, and the night after that. He developed a system, a ritual of precise movements that became as automatic as breathing. He would walk his patrol at exactly the same pace every night, creating a predictable pattern that the prisoners could time. He would pause at the drainage hatch for exactly 15 seconds, just long enough to pull the bolt and ensure the opening was clear. Then he would continue his route, mechanical and emotionless, the perfect ghost. The prisoners learned to watch for him, to decode the rhythm of his movements. They developed their own signals, their own communication networks that operated beneath the notice of the guards. A cough at a certain moment, a specific way of standing during roll call, a coded message passed through the work lines. Vogel never spoke to them, never acknowledged them. To maintain his cover, he had to remain the perfect SS guard during the day, cold, brutal, indifferent to suffering. But every night, at 3:35 a.m., the hatch opened. And every night, ghosts slipped through. Hauptsturmführer Karl-Heinz arrived on a Wednesday morning in late September, stepping out of a black Mercedes with the bearing of a man who believed himself to be the hand of destiny. He was 42, impeccably dressed, even in the mud and chaos of the camp, with the kind of cold intelligence that made even other SS officers nervous. His eyes were the color of winter ice, and they moved constantly, cataloging, measuring, calculating. Cross had built his reputation as a forensic investigator, the man called in when camps had irregularities that needed explaining. They called him the Bloodhound, because once he caught a scent, he never let go. Work Group 7 had an irregularity, a significant one. Over the past 6 months, 214 prisoners had simply disappeared. Not died, disappeared. Their bodies weren't in the crusher. They weren't in the mass graves. They weren't logged in the execution records. They had simply vanished from the face of the earth, as if the ground had swallowed them whole. Camp Commandant Cyrus was furious. Escapes made him look incompetent. Escapes suggested weakness, suggested that the camp wasn't running with the brutal efficiency Berlin demanded. Escapes could cost him his command, could even lead to his own execution for dereliction of duty. So he had called in Cross to find the leak and plug it permanently and publicly. Cross spent his first week observing. He didn't interrogate anyone. He didn't inspect the fences or the watchtowers. He simply watched with those ice-blue eyes, a notebook always in his hand. He timed the guard rotations down to the second. He measured the sight lines from every watchtower. He studied the weather patterns and the work schedules. He interviewed prisoners with a politeness that was somehow more terrifying than brutality. He was looking for what he called dead space, gaps in surveillance where the impossible became possible. Vogel felt the noose tightening around his neck. Cross had a way of looking at people that suggested he could see through skin and bone directly into their thoughts, could read guilt in the way a man breathed. During morning roll call, Cross would stand at the edge of the formation, absolutely still, his eyes moving slowly from face to face, cataloging every nervous gesture, every averted gaze, every bead of sweat. But Vogel had an advantage. He was a ghost. He had perfected the art of being invisible, of showing nothing, of existing without truly being present. When Cross's eyes swept over him, they found only a hollowed-out shell of a man going through the motions, just another broken soldier who had seen too much on the Eastern Front. Nothing suspicious, nothing worth investigating, nothing at all. Cross assembled his findings in the commandant's office like a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. Maps covered the walls. Timelines had been drawn in meticulous detail. Guard rotation schedules were pinned to boards with colored threads connecting various points. Weather reports going back 6 months were spread across the desk. He had reduced the mystery to mathematics, to patterns that could be analyzed and exploited. Work Group 7 has a 15% higher disappearance rate than any other section of the camp, Cross explained, his finger tracing a circle on the map around the quarry drainage area. His voice was calm, almost professorial. The disappearances occur exclusively on nights with heavy rainfall, exclusively during the 3:30 to 4 a.m. time window, and exclusively when Unterscharführer Vogel is on patrol. The correlation is statistically impossible to ignore. Vogel wasn't in the room, but he heard about it from another guard later that day. Cross had narrowed it down, not to the exact mechanism yet, but close enough, dangerously close. The investigation was entering its final phase, and everyone knew what that meant. Someone would hang. Someone always hung when the Bloodhound found his quarry. That night, as Vogel walked his patrol through the rain, he saw Cross standing in the shadows near the Crusher building, watching. Just watching with those ice-blue eyes that never seemed to blink. The rain pounded down, the Crushers screamed their mechanical symphony, and Vogel continued his routine with robotic precision. He walked past the drainage hatch without pausing, didn't touch the bolt, didn't even look at it, just kept walking, boots splashing through the mud in their usual rhythm.
Cross watched for 3 hours, standing motionless in the rain like a statue carved from ice. Then, just before dawn, he left without a word. Vogel knew exactly what was happening. Cross was applying pressure, forcing him to make a mistake. If Vogel stopped using the hatch, Cross would know he was the leak. If Vogel continued, Cross would eventually catch him in the act. It was a trap with no escape, a noose that tightened no matter which direction you moved. But Vogel had already accepted that he was a dead man. The moment he pulled that first bolt 6 months ago, he had traded his life for theirs. The only question now was how many more he could save before the rope found his neck. How many more names he could add to the invisible ledger he kept in his mind. If you believe that one person standing up against evil matters, hit that subscribe button. People like Cross won't. And you need to hear what happened when the silent savior had to become the monster.
The next night, Vogel opened the hatch again. 14 prisoners escaped into the rain. The night after that, 11 more. He had stopped trying to be cautious. If Cross was going to catch him, then Vogel would make sure as many people as possible made it out before that happened. Every night became a race against time, a gamble with death where the stakes were measured in human lives. But the cost of maintaining his cover was becoming unbearable. During the day, he had to be the perfect SS guard. He had to enforce the rules with mechanical brutality. He had to punish infractions. He had to pretend that these people were his enemies, that their suffering meant nothing to him. He had to be the monster to hide the savior. On a Thursday afternoon, a prisoner named Jakob, a mathematics professor from Vienna with kind eyes and hands scarred from quarry work, stumbled while carrying a granite block up the stairs. The block slipped from his weakened grip, crashed down the steps, and nearly hit a guard. Standard procedure was 20 lashes, public punishment to maintain discipline. Vogel administered them himself. He had to. If he showed mercy, if he hesitated even for a moment, Cross would notice. The Bloodhound was always watching, always measuring, always calculating. So Vogel raised the whip and brought it down again and again while Jakob screamed. The leather cut through the thin fabric of the prison uniform, opened wounds that would become infected in the filthy conditions of the barracks. The other prisoners watched with hatred burning in their eyes. They didn't know about the hatch. They didn't know about the midnight escapes. All they knew was that Vogel was just another SS monster, another face of the machine that was grinding them to dust. After the punishment, as Jakob was being dragged back to the barracks by 2 other prisoners, Vogel waited until the guards weren't looking. Then he moved close, pretending to inspect the fallen granite block, and slipped a piece of folded paper into Jakob's pocket. His hands moved with practiced speed, the gesture so quick it was almost invisible. It was a crude map showing the drainage tunnel route to the river with a 12-minute window marked clearly. The distances were measured, the timing was precise. Jakob would understand, or he wouldn't. Either way, Vogel had done what he could. He had hurt a man to save him, had become the torturer to play the liberator. The moral calculus made him sick, but he had long ago stopped believing in moral absolutes. There was only survival and death, and the narrow space between where choices still mattered. That night, Jakob was gone. So were 6 others who had received the map through a whisper network that Vogel never fully understood. The prisoners had developed their own system, their own communication channels that operated beneath the notice of the guards. They called the drainage route the Ghost's Door, never knowing the Ghost's real name, never suspecting that the man who beat them was the same man who freed them.
October 20th, 1944. The Allied bombing campaign had intensified to the point where the air raid sirens were as common as the Crusher noise. American B-17s were hitting industrial targets throughout Austria, and Mauthausen, with its granite production feeding the Reich's infrastructure, was on the target list. The night sky had become a theater of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, tracer rounds drawing bright lines through the darkness. On this particular night, the bombers came at 3:15 a.m., earlier than usual. The sky lit up like daylight as searchlights swept across the clouds. The camp descended into chaos as guards abandoned their posts to reach the reinforced bunkers. The Crushers shut down for the first time in weeks. The watchtowers went dark. Everyone was running, screaming, diving for cover as the first bombs began to fall on the industrial complex half a kilometer away. Vogel saw the opportunity immediately. This wasn't just 12 minutes, this was hours, maybe the last hours he would ever have, the last chance to pull the bolt before Cross's noose finally tightened around his neck. He ran through the rain and the explosions to the prisoner barracks, throwing open doors and shouting in German, "Anyone who wants to live, follow me now. This is your only chance." Most of the prisoners thought it was a trick, some sadistic game designed to justify mass executions. They had been conditioned to death from men in SS uniforms. But a few, the ones who had heard whispers about the Ghost's Door, the ones who had received crude maps or coded messages, understood. 87 prisoners followed him through the darkness to the drainage hatch. Vogel wrenched it open with strength born of desperation and started pushing people through. The tunnel leads to the Danube. Follow the current. Stay underwater as long as you can. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run.
They poured through. Professors, laborers, resistance fighters. Allied airmen shot down over Austria. Old men and teenagers. The sick and the strong. Jews, Poles, French, Russians, Germans. Vogel counted each one, memorizing faces he would never see again, cataloging names he would try to remember if he survived long enough to write them down. And then, through the rain and the explosions and the chaos, he saw a figure approaching with measured, deliberate steps. Oscar Cross, walking calmly through the pandemonium as if taking a Sunday stroll, his uniform impeccable despite the mud and smoke, a Luger pistol held loosely in his right hand. "Unterscharführer Vogel," Cross said, his voice barely audible over the bombing, but somehow cutting through the noise with absolute clarity. "I knew it was you. From the very beginning, I knew." Vogel straightened, his hand moving instinctively to his own sidearm. Behind him, the last of the prisoners were disappearing into the tunnel, their shadows swallowed by the darkness. 87 souls, added to the 214 who had gone before. Over 300 lives pulled from the jaws of the machine. "Then why didn't you stop me sooner?" Vogel asked. The question had been burning in his mind for weeks. "You had the evidence. You had the pattern. Why let it continue?" Cross smiled. It was a terrible smile, empty of warmth, but full of something that might have been respect. "Tell me, Vogel, was it worth it? Knowing that you'll hang for this? knowing that your name will be erased from history as a traitor?
Vogel looked at the open hatch, at the darkness beyond where those 300 lives had vanished into the night and the rain. He thought about the carved Bible verse in the granite. He thought about the Ukrainian village and the children against the barn wall and the girl with the rag doll. He thought about all the things he had done and all the things he had failed to do. All the moments when he had stood silent, and all the moments when he had finally chosen to act. Yes, he said simply, it was worth it. Cross raised his pistol, the barrel aimed directly at Vogel's chest. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Vogel thought this was it. Execution in the mud during an air raid, anonymous and unrecorded. A traitor's death for a traitor's crime. But then a massive explosion struck the crusher building, sending a shock wave that knocked both men to the ground. Metal shrieked, stone shattered, the world became fire and noise. When Vogel looked up, coughing blood from where he'd bitten his tongue, Cross was gone, disappeared into the smoke and flames like he had never been there at all. Vogel never saw him again.
Vogel closed the hatch that night for the last time. He returned to his post, standing at attention in the rain like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just saved 87 lives while bombs fell around him. When the all clear sounded 2 hours later, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The perfect ghost, the perfect soldier. Cross filed his report the next morning. It was meticulous, detailed, and completely fabricated. According to his official findings, the disappearances were the result of administrative errors, prisoners being inadvertently crushed in the stone crushers during night operations, their remains mixed with the granite and shipped out as gravel. Paperwork mistakes, nothing more. Case closed. Investigation complete. Vogel never learned why Cross lied in that report. Maybe he respected the audacity of the betrayal, the sheer scale of the deception carried out under the nose of the entire SS apparatus. Maybe he was disgusted by what the camp represented and couldn't bring himself to execute one of the few men trying to stop the machine. Maybe he calculated that letting Vogel continue was strategically valuable in some way that only the Bloodhound understood. Or maybe, just maybe, Cross had seen enough death and decided that one act of mercy wouldn't damn his soul any more than it already was. Whatever the reason, Cross left Mauthausen 3 days later and never returned. Vogel continued his midnight routine until January 1945, when the advancing Soviet forces made escape routes irrelevant and the camp began its chaotic dissolution. In total, he facilitated the disappearance of 301 prisoners. Not one of them ever knew his name. Not one of them ever knew that the ghost who beat them during the day was the same ghost who freed them at night. When the Americans liberated Mauthausen on May 5, 1945, Vogel was gone. He had stripped off his uniform in the final hours before liberation, walked out with a crowd of displaced persons, and vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. No one looked for him. No one knew to look. He was just another face in the endless river of refugees flooding across the continent.
Karl-Heinz Vogel died in a typhoid camp near Munich in December 1945, buried in an unmarked grave with hundreds of other refugees who had survived the war, only to succumb to disease in the aftermath. No one knew he was an SS guard. No one knew what he had done. He died anonymous, unmourned, unrecognized, just another casualty of the war. Another name that would never appear in any history book. For 50 years,
The story of the ghost's door remained a whispered legend among Mauthausen survivors. They knew someone had helped them. They knew there had been a pattern to the escapes, a rhythm to the salvation, but they didn't know who, and the chaos of liberation had scattered them across the world before they could compare notes and piece together the full picture. In 1994, a construction crew demolishing the old crusher building at Mauthausen discovered something extraordinary. Hidden in a hollowed-out granite block near the drainage tunnel, sealed behind a carefully placed stone that had been mortared back into position, they found a collection of papers wrapped in oilcloth, a journal of sorts, written in cramped, precise handwriting that filled page after page. It was Vogel's record. Every name he could remember, every face he had memorized in those brief moments at the hatch. 301 souls, documented with the meticulous care of a theologian cataloging the faithful. He had recorded where they were from, what they looked like, what they had been imprisoned for, their crimes against the Reich, their hopes for after the war. He had carved their names into paper with the same devotion someone had once carved scripture into granite, creating a monument that the Reich could never erase. At the bottom of the last page, written in a hand that trembled with exhaustion or emotion, he had added a single line: "I could not save them all, but I saved these. Let God judge if it was enough." The journal was authenticated by Holocaust historians and put on display at the Mauthausen Memorial. Survivors, now elderly, their children and grandchildren standing beside them, came forward to confirm they had escaped through the ghost's door. Jakob, the mathematics professor who had been whipped by Vogel, was among them. He had carried Vogel's map all the way to Switzerland, had survived the war, had built a new life.
"I hated him," Jakob said, during a recorded interview in 1995, tears streaming down his weathered face. "When he beat me, I wanted him dead. I fantasized about killing him with my bare hands. But then I found the map in my pocket, and I understood. He had to hurt me to save me. That's what makes his sacrifice so terrible, so impossible to comprehend. He couldn't even be recognized for what he was doing. He had to be the monster, to be the hero. He had to accept our hatred, to earn our survival." A small stone monument was erected near the drainage tunnel in 1996. It bears Vogel's name and a single inscription, the same verse he found carved into the granite that night in March 1944. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." 301 people lived because one man decided that mechanical obedience was a choice, not a destiny. That even in the machinery of genocide, there were still bolts that could be pulled, hatches that could be opened, ghosts that could become guides instead of executioners. Karl-Heinz Vogel couldn't undo what he had witnessed in Ukraine. He couldn't bring back the children against the barn wall or erase the years of complicity. But in the rain-soaked darkness of Mauthausen, he proved that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about refusing to let the future repeat it. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you are watching this from. Represent your country. The ghost's door remained open for exactly 183 nights, and on every one of those nights, a man in a death's head uniform chose silence over safety, damnation over complicity, and the lives of strangers over his own survival. The Reich tried to erase him. History almost succeeded, but the stone remembered. The stone and the 301 souls who walked through his door into the rain and the darkness and the possibility of tomorrow always remembers. And now, so do we.